Keanu Reeves stood on the rooftop terrace of his secluded mountain retreat, quietly gazing at the endless horizon. The sunset painted the sky with vibrant shades of orange and deep crimson, creating a breathtakingly peaceful scene. A gentle breeze swept by, carrying the faint scent of the surrounding trees, a reminder of the tranquility he rarely experienced amid his busy life. But Keanu's mind was far from quiet. Unlike the scenery before him, thoughts swirled relentlessly in his head, questions arising without end. For years, he had devoted not only his passion to acting, but had also used his success to help those less fortunate. He had contributed to hospitals, funded struggling artists pursuing their dreams, and supported numerous charitable organizations worldwide. Yet, the deeper he got into these efforts, the more he realized a harsh truth. Too many people needed help, but geographic distances, bureaucracy, and invisible barriers often prevented aid from reaching the right places at the right time. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we have another special tale waiting just for you. Then, in a moment of clarity, an idea struck him: a private jet, not for luxury, but for impact, a way to transcend geographical limitations, to bring direct aid to remote regions, to reach disaster-stricken areas swiftly, and even to create life-changing experiences for those who had never stepped outside their hometowns. He knew this idea would not be easy to realize. A private jet was not just a means of transportation, it required careful planning, operational resources, and, most importantly, a clear mission. Keanu immediately contacted Marcus, his close friend and trusted business partner. When Keanu shared his vision, Marcus was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I get it, Keanu, and I think this is a crazy idea, but it's also incredibly meaningful. If anyone can make it happen, it's you." Motivated by Marcus's support, Keanu dived straight into research. He spent hours reading about different types of aircraft, calculating costs, and learning about humanitarian organizations that used planes as their primary means of transport for aid and relief missions. He wanted to ensure that this jet would not only meet his needs, but also be truly effective in operations. He also reached out to humanitarian pilots, people who had dedicated their careers to flying across the skies, delivering hope to the world's most disadvantaged regions. Every conversation deepened his understanding of the responsibility he was about to undertake. The journey to find the perfect aircraft was not simple. Keanu and Marcus spent weeks visiting airports, speaking with manufacturers, and even test flying several models. Some planes were too extravagant, others were not suited for his mission, but Keanu was in no rush. He wanted to be certain that when he made his decision, it would be the best possible choice. Finally, on a crisp morning at a private airstrip in California, Keanu saw it. A jet that wasn't overly luxurious but was strong and versatile enough to meet his requirements. It could transport aid supplies, carry a small team for relief missions, and, most importantly, had the ability to land on short runways, an essential feature for reaching remote or disaster-stricken areas. As Keanu signed the contract, he felt his heart pounding. This was not just a purchase, it was a turning point in his journey. In that moment, he was no longer just a famous actor. He was a man with a clear purpose. But the challenges didn't end there. Owning a plane was just the beginning. Keanu and Marcus continued working with humanitarian organizations, mapping out the most effective flight routes, and planning their first missions. They assembled a team of pilots, relief workers, and logistics experts, ensuring that every flight would carry not only supplies but also hope and real change for those in need. A few weeks later, the first opportunity came. A massive earthquake had devastated a region in South America, leaving thousands homeless. Transportation systems had collapsed, and relief supplies had yet to reach those affected. Without hesitation, Keanu and his team sprang into action. They loaded the aircraft with emergency aid, food, water, blankets, and medicine. As the jet took off, Keanu sat in the cabin, feeling the soft vibrations of the engine, his heart filled with an indescribable emotion. This was no longer just a dream. it was real. Upon landing in the disaster-stricken region, Keanu saw firsthand what he had only read about in news reports. People who had lost everything, children wandering through the rubble. But as the aid was distributed, as he witnessed smiles, grateful embraces, and glimmers of hope returning to weary faces, Keanu knew he had made the right choice. Standing among the people he was helping, Keanu Reeves was no longer just a Hollywood star. He was a man willing to step out of his comfort zone to change the world in the way he could. And to him, that was the true meaning of life. The morning of his first mission unfolded beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost painted. The sun cast long golden streaks across the horizon, and the world felt charged with purpose. Today was the day. Keanu Reeves had been on countless flights before, but this one was different. This wasn't about a film premiere or a glamorous event. It was about something bigger than himself. A devastating earthquake had ravaged a coastal town in South America, leaving thousands homeless. Supplies were desperately needed, and he was determined to help. As his sleek black SUV rolled toward the private airstrip, Keanu sat in contemplative silence. His fingers lightly drummed against the leather armrest as he mentally reviewed the relief efforts they had planned. His team had spent weeks coordinating with local organizations, ensuring that the aid would be distributed efficiently. Every detail had been checked and rechecked, and yet, there was always that gnawing sense that more could be done. He exhaled slowly, pushing away the self-imposed pressure. Focus. Stay in the moment. The car came to a smooth stop near the hangar, where his private jet gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't extravagance, it was a necessity. Owning the aircraft allowed him to bypass bureaucratic red tape, making urgent missions like this one possible. He stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting the collar of his worn leather jacket, his boots crunching against the tarmac as he moved toward the waiting crew. Then came the voice. "Hey, hold it right there." Keanu stopped mid-stride, turning in the direction of the abrupt command. A uniformed security guard was striding toward him, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. There was something about his stance, chin jutted forward, arms tense, that put Keanu on alert. He'd dealt with overzealous security before, but there was an edge to this man's voice that made the moment feel different. "This is a restricted area. You're not allowed here." Keanu raised an eyebrow but kept his tone polite. "I know. I have a flight scheduled. That's my jet." He gestured toward the aircraft, his voice even controlled. The guard stopped a few feet away, narrowing his eyes as he gave Keanu a once-over. There was no mistaking the skepticism in his gaze, the silent assessment that had nothing to do with security protocol. "Your jet?" The guard let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "That's funny. Let's see some ID." Keanu held back a sigh, keeping his frustration in check. He was used to being recognized, but he was also used to being underestimated in unexpected places. Without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his identification along with the official ownership documents for the jet. He extended them, meeting the guard's gaze directly. The man barely glanced at them before shaking his head. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but guys like you don't own jets like this." For a brief moment, silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken yet unmistakable. Keanu's jaw tightened. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he knew prejudice when he saw it. He had encountered doubt before, people questioning his generosity, his motives, but this was different. It was immediate, unprovoked. "Look," Keanu said, his voice steady, though there was a new steeliness in it. "I have my paperwork. My crew is waiting. If there's an issue, let's sort it out professionally." But the guard wasn't interested in professionalism. "I've seen this before," he muttered, folding his arms. "You don't belong here. I'm calling the police." Keanu stared at him, barely able to process what he had just heard. He wasn't naive. He knew the world was filled with people who judged based on their own narrow perceptions. But in this moment, all he felt was disbelief, the absurdity of it. He had spent years proving himself in ways that had nothing to do with fame, wealth, or appearances. And still, here he was, being dismissed outright. His flight crew had gathered nearby, their expressions a mix of concern and quiet anger. A few of the relief workers on board had stepped to the aircraft's door, their worried faces peering down at the confrontation. Keanu exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "Sir," one of his pilots called out, stepping forward. "Is there a problem? This is Mr. Reeves. He owns the jet. We're scheduled for departure in 30 minutes. The guard barely spared the pilot a glance. "If you don't want to be involved, step back." Then, pressing a button on his radio, he called in the authorities. Keanu's fists clenched briefly before he relaxed them. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He had learned long ago that anger rarely solved anything. He cast a glance toward the open sky. Inhaling deeply, he could hear the murmur of his crew behind him, the barely restrained outrage in their voices. He caught the eyes of a young relief worker standing near the plane's steps. She looked uneasy, shifting on her feet. The distant wail of sirens cut through the morning air, growing louder by the second. The situation had spiraled beyond reason, and now he had a choice to make: continue to stand his ground or find another way forward. He had faced adversity before, but this was something else. He wasn't just being stopped, he was being judged. He turned his attention back to the guard, his expression unreadable. "When the police get here, I hope they're more interested in the truth than you are." The guard sneered, but before he could respond, the first squad car pulled up, tires screeching slightly against the pavement. Two officers stepped out, eyes scanning the scene, hands hovering near their belts. Keanu stood tall, his posture relaxed but commanding. He had nothing to hide, and he refused to be intimidated. He wasn't here to fight, but he wasn't about to let ignorance stand in the way of a mission that meant everything to the people waiting on the other side. And so, as the officers approached, Keanu took a slow, steady breath. Whatever came next, he would handle it the way he always did, with patience, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the morning air like a warning. Within moments, two police cars pulled up at the edge of the airstrip, their tires crunching against the pavement as they came to a stop. The doors opened in unison, and three officers stepped out, scanning the scene with practiced caution. Keanu remained composed, standing tall despite the tension crackling in the air. His hands remained at his sides, his posture open but resolute. He had done nothing wrong, and he wouldn't let this turn into something it wasn't. He watched as one of the officers, a man in his late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached with measured steps, his eyes flickering over Keanu before settling on the security guard who had called them. "We got a report about unauthorized access to this airstrip," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. His gaze shifted back to Keanu, assessing him with professional detachment. Keanu met his eyes steadily before reaching into his jacket, his movements deliberate. Without a word, he retrieved his identification and ownership documents and handed them over. There was no rush, no defensiveness, just a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was in the right. The officer took the documents, flipping through them with practiced efficiency. His brow furrowed slightly, but not in suspicion, just focus. A few moments passed in silence before he turned to the security guard, his expression impassive. "Everything checks out. This man owns the aircraft." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. Keanu watched as the guard stiffened, his face betraying a flicker of something. Was it embarrassment? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might dissolve with nothing more than an awkward nod and a dismissive wave. But Keanu wasn't about to let it go. Not this time. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "No apology for wasting my time? For assuming I didn't belong here?" The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. It was clear he hadn't expected a challenge, especially not from someone as famous as Keanu Reeves. But before he could respond, the security guard cut in, his tone clipped and defensive. "Just doing my job," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "You should be glad we're thorough." A quiet murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. His flight crew, the relief workers, the pilots. The tension hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had thickened, pressing against the moment like a storm about to break. Keanu took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't angry, not in the way that made people reckless, but he was frustrated. He had seen this before, felt it before. The way people made snap judgments, the way bias still dictated access and assumptions. It wasn't just about him. It was about the world, about how things operated in subtle yet undeniable ways. "This wasn't thorough," he said finally, his voice even but pointed. He looked directly at the guard, not with hostility, but with unwavering certainty. This was profiling. The murmur grew louder as people exchanged glances. The relief workers nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting a quiet understanding of what had just happened. His crew, though professional, couldn't hide the flickers of irritation on their faces. They had witnessed the entire encounter, and the unfairness of it was undeniable. The officer shifted again, clearing his throat. He glanced at his colleagues, as if hoping for support, but none came. Instead, there was only silence, the kind that forced people to sit with their own discomfort. Keanu held the guard's gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled, letting the weight of the moment settle. He had said what needed to be said. Whether it changed anything or not was out of his control. Without another word, he turned and strode toward his jet, the morning sun catching the edges of his leather jacket as he moved. His boots echoed against the tarmac, a rhythmic reminder that he wasn't leaving defeated. He was leaving with purpose intact. As he stepped onto the plane, the excitement that had once filled him about the mission was now clouded by frustration, not for himself, but for the reality of what had just transpired. But Keanu Reeves wasn't the kind of man who let anger dictate his actions. Once the plane was airborne, the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, providing a rhythm to Keanu's thoughts. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the world stretched beneath him, vast and indifferent. The confrontation at the airstrip replayed in his mind, each detail sharpening in clarity. The guard's dismissive tone, the way his crew had looked on in quiet outrage, the fleeting hesitation in the officer's face before he upheld the truth. Each moment etched itself into his memory. How many times had this happened to someone who didn't have the luxury of proving themselves? How many people had been turned away, dismissed, judged, with no recourse, no voice? The thought gnawed at him. He had always tried to use his influence for good, but this was different. This was personal, not because it had happened to him, but because it had exposed something larger, something systemic. A soft voice pulled him from his reverie. "Keanu?" He turned to see Laura, his assistant, sitting across from him. She had known him long enough to recognize when he was lost in thought. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked, her expression both curious and expectant. Keanu exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the armrest. The usual answer would have been to let it go, to move forward, to focus on the mission ahead. But that didn't sit right with him this time. This wasn't something he could simply brush aside. And then it hit him. He pulled out his phone, his movements purposeful. If this had happened to him, someone with the privilege of fame, with cameras and witnesses around, what was happening to those who had no one to speak for them? No cameras, no audience, just quiet indignities piling up, unnoticed and unchallenged? He pressed the record. The front-facing camera framed his face, the cabin lights soft behind him. He took a breath, steadying himself, then spoke. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "What happened today happens to people every day. People who don't have the means to challenge it. People who get turned away, who are judged at first glance, who are treated as if they don't belong before they even have a chance to prove otherwise." His grip on the phone tightened slightly, his mind flashing back to the guard's sneer, the way he had dismissed the proof in front of him simply because he had already made up his mind. "I had resources. I had witnesses. I had the ability to stand there and push back. But what about the people who don't? What about the ones who are silenced? Who walk away because they know no one will believe them?" A pause. He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "We talk about equality. We talk about fairness. But the truth is, moments like this show how far we still have to go. It's not just about me. It's about all of us. And we have to do better." He stopped recording, his pulse steady. He didn't need to overthink it. The message was raw, real. He sent it out, attaching a simple caption, "We need to talk about this." By the time they landed, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Laura turned to him, her eyes wide. "Keanu, you need to see this." He unlocked his phone and immediately saw the explosion. Hashtag Keanu Speaks Out was trending. So was Flying While Judged. Thousands of comments poured in. Stories from people who had faced similar treatment. People thanking him for speaking up. People sharing their own experiences of being judged for how they looked, where they were, who they were perceived to be. The private airstrip had already released a public apology. The guard had been fired. But Keanu knew that wasn't enough. Real change didn't come from a single apology or one person losing their job. It came from action, from conversations that led to shifts in perception, from policies that prevented this from happening in the first place. He looked at Laura, determination settling into his bones. "This isn't where it ends," he said. "This is just the beginning." Because moments like these weren't just obstacles, they were opportunities. And if he could turn this into something bigger, something that led to real change, then it wouldn't have just been another frustrating experience. It would have been a turning point. The experience at the airstrip had been a wake-up call for Keanu. It wasn't just about him. It was about a system that needed to change, about opportunities denied based on perception rather than truth. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words. And now, he was determined to turn a moment of injustice into something lasting. With his team, Keanu launched Skybound Hope, an initiative that repurposed his private jet for humanitarian efforts. The mission was simple yet profound: to use aviation as a means of delivering hope and critical aid where it was needed most. The initiative quickly took shape, with 3 core objectives: flying medical patients to urgent care, ensuring that those in critical need could reach life-saving treatment regardless of location, providing scholarships for aviation careers, opening doors for young pilots who lack the means to pursue their dreams, delivering emergency aid to crisis zones, responding to natural disasters, war zones, and humanitarian crises with speed and efficiency. Their first mission was as symbolic as it was essential. A young boy named Matteo, diagnosed with a severe heart condition, had never left his small rural village. Medical facilities nearby lacked the expertise for the life-saving surgery he desperately needed. Without intervention, his prognosis was grim. The answer? A flight aboard Skybound Hope's first official humanitarian mission. As the jet prepared for departure, Keanu himself stood at the base of the stairs, waiting to greet Matteo and his mother. The boy clung tightly to his mother's hand, his dark eyes darting around, taking in the enormous aircraft before him. Keanu knelt to his level, his voice warm. "Are you ready for an adventure, Matteo?" For the first time since arriving, Matteo smiled, wide and full of wonder. It wasn't just a flight. It was hope. It was the possibility of a future. The engines roared to life, and as the wheels lifted from the ground, Skybound Hope officially took off, not just for Matteo, but for a mission that would change thousands of lives. Within a year, Skybound Hope had completed 72 missions across multiple countries, touching the lives of thousands. They had transported critical medical patients, reunited families, and brought much-needed supplies to devastated regions. The world had taken notice. One evening, as Keanu sat in his office, reviewing the growing list of upcoming missions, Laura burst through the door, breathless and holding a tablet. "You won't believe this," she said, eyes shining with excitement. "A major foundation wants to fund Skybound Hope to expand globally." Keanu looked up, absorbing the weight of her words. He had started this mission with the simple goal of turning injustice into impact. Now, it was on the verge of becoming something even greater. A rare smile crossed his face. "Let's do it," he said, "but we stay true to the mission. This is about people, not the press." Laura nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Skybound Hope wasn't about making headlines. It was about making a difference. A few days later, Keanu stood on the tarmac once again, watching as another relief flight took off into the sky. The hum of the jet engines, the cool night air against his skin, it all felt surreal. He thought back to that one moment at the airstrip, the way he had been blocked, The way assumptions had tried to limit him. That moment had sparked something bigger than he ever imagined. He had turned a personal slight into a force for good. And yet, there was still so much more to do. Because as long as there were people who needed a hand up, who were denied opportunities because of perception rather than reality, Keanu Reeves would be there. Because that's what real heroes do. Within a year, Skybound Hope had completed 72 missions across multiple countries, touching the lives of thousands. They had transported critical medical patients, reunited families, and brought much-needed supplies to devastated regions. The world had taken notice. One evening, as Keanu sat in his office, reviewing the growing list of upcoming missions, Laura burst through the door, breathless and holding a tablet. "You won't believe this," she said, eyes shining with excitement. "A major foundation wants to fund Skybound Hope to expand globally." Keanu looked up, absorbing the weight of her words. He had started this mission with the simple goal of turning injustice into impact. Now, it was on the verge of becoming something even greater. A rare smile crossed his face. "Let's do it," he said, "but we stay true to the mission. This is about people, not the press." Laura nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Skybound Hope wasn't about making headlines. It was about making a difference. A few days later, Keanu stood on the tarmac once again, watching as another relief flight took off into the sky. The hum of the jet engines, the cool night air against his skin, it all felt surreal. But as the organization grew, so did the resistance. Not everyone was thrilled about Skybound Hope's rapid expansion. Certain bureaucrats saw it as a challenge to their authority, and powerful figures who profited from inefficiency in humanitarian aid viewed it as a disruption. The first warning came subtly, a delay in permits for a crucial flight to war-torn refugees. Then came logistical issues at airports that had previously welcomed them without hesitation. The red tape was tightening. One night, Laura stormed into his office, frustration written across her face. "Keanu, something's off. Our supply shipments to South America are being held up for inspection. We've never had this problem before." Keanu's jaw tightened. "Who's behind this?" She shook her head. "No clear name yet, but someone's trying to slow us down." Keanu knew that when you disrupted the status quo, you made enemies. He wasn't naive about the politics of humanitarian work, but he hadn't expected pushback this soon. "We don't stop," he said firmly. "If they block us one way, we'll find another." A week later, Keanu found himself in an unexpected meeting with a group of influential philanthropists and activists who had taken notice of Skybound Hope's struggles. "You need allies," one of them said. "Powerful ones." Keanu wasn't one to seek out political influence, but he knew that sometimes the right connections could open doors that bureaucracy tried to keep shut. With the backing of a coalition of supporters, including a former world leader and a high-profile tech mogul, Skybound Hope's work continued, albeit under increasing scrutiny. And then, something unexpected happened. The guard who had blocked Keanu from his own jet months before had remained silent as the story blew up worldwide. But as the movement gained momentum, investigative journalists began uncovering troubling patterns. It turned out that the guard had been involved in multiple discriminatory incidents, barring access to people based on personal bias. Reports surfaced of him blocking aid workers, delaying emergency flights, and even being linked to corruption within the private airstrip security firm. One evening, as Keanu scrolled through the latest developments, Laura sat beside him. "It's all coming full circle," she murmured. "The injustice that started this? It was never just about you." Keanu nodded. "It never was." The guard was fired. But Keanu knew that real change didn't come from one person losing their job. It came from dismantling the structures that allowed it to happen in the first place. Skybound Hope had become more than just a humanitarian mission. It had become a symbol, a movement against barriers, both physical and systemic. Keanu's personal experience had opened a door to a much larger conversation. As he stood on the tarmac once more, watching a new fleet of Skybound Hope jets preparing for departure, he reflected on the journey. A simple, unjust moment at an airstrip had set everything in motion. What had once been an obstacle had become an opportunity. What had once been a personal slight had become a force for good. And yet, the mission was far from over. Because as long as there were people being judged before being heard, denied before being understood, Keanu Reeves would be there. Because the fight against injustice doesn't end. It evolves. And what happens next? That would shock everyone.